you, David, for that lovely intro. And I want to give a quick shout out before I start to all the incredible folks over at In Use who put on a phenomenal conference. I mean, the sun's out in Stockholm. The sun is here to celebrate with us. And truly, you all did a phenomenal job. Yeah. I am so happy to be here with you all, and now is the obligatory part of the talk where I mention that this is the first time in a very long time that I have given a conference keynote, and I have been 99.372% confident that all of y'all are fully clothed. It's been a lot of online conferences the past few years, but I'm so happy to be here in person, and yeah, let's get to it. So, as he said, my name is Zhou, pronouns she, her, and believe it or not, I'm actually originally from the US, although I live here now in Stockholm, where I've been for the past 2.5 years. And you can tell that I've been here for 2.5 years because the conference organizers asked us to refrain from wearing black clothing on stage, and I had to go buy like a whole new wardrobe. So here it is. Yeah, and I'm also the creator of the Design Ethically project when I'm not working at Spotify. And I've been working on this for the past 3 years. Started it when I was in DC. And last but not least, I'm the mom to this rescue doggo in the photo who looks a lot more serious than he actually is. So if you haven't checked out Design Ethically, you can do so at that URL. It's essentially a free framework and toolkit for designers or folks in product teams who are curious about using more practices that use applied ethics in their day-to-day design work. Okay, so why ethics? Specifically, why ethics in tech or design? Now, the more and more I give this talk, the more shorter this section becomes, because I feel like people are starting to get it. All of you probably get it because you came to a conference themed around ethics and sustainability and resilience. And I don't want to preach to the choir here. Clearly, there's a lot of problems in the tech industry, in the design industry, and while we have done design for good, there's also been a lot of design that's created not so good consequences. And in my work with Design Ethically, I've had the luck to just travel around the world and meet people in all sorts of industries, from tech to academia to nonprofit and government. And I think there's some salient common themes around. First of which is that people generally do care about this stuff. Nobody wakes up on a Monday and says, I'm going to go make the world a worse place at my job. It's not that common. Secondly, generally, folks feel like they are this cog in the big, vast machine that is life, right? It's really easy to feel like you're just this one wee person in the great abyss who happens to be at this conference. And that's really relatable for a lot of folks. It's also easy to feel that your impact extends to those directly around you, like your friends and family and close colleagues. But I want to remind you that, especially if you are working as a designer in tech, if you're designing products that touch dozens or hundreds or thousands or millions of people, your impact is quite large. And as a designer in tech or beyond, you have a lot of privilege and responsibility, right? It's a privilege to be working remotely and safely during an ongoing pandemic. It's a privilege to be making a tech salary in a lot of cities. It's a privilege to be effectively shaping the realities of the folks that you're designing for. Because as designers, we're crafting their choice architectures. We're crafting the systems in which they make their decisions, and that's a lot of responsibility there. And when you take that privilege and you multiply it by the amount of technological diffusion there is, just by virtue of all the devices that we're designing for, all the locales that we're designing within, that leads to amplified power. So my rhetorical question for you all is, what are you doing with that power? Who are you uplifting? Are you holding true to existing power inequities, or are you trying to fix things and amplify the voices of the vulnerable? Now, here's a relatively uncontroversial statement that is kind of like our implied job statement, which is that we should be defining and designing ethical experiences and ensuring that they pose no significant harm. But I want to add 2 caveats, because first of all, the term ethical is really vague, very hand-wavy, and it's been used in a lot of ethics washing by tech companies, where they say one thing and then do the complete opposite. So when I say ethical, I mean explicitly anti-racist, I mean sustainable, I mean equitable, and I mean compassionate, right? We often are told that we have to design for certain key metrics and to boost our ROI and for the bottom line, right? But fundamentally, we should be designing for people and animals in the environment and the world around us. And when I say pose no significant harm, what I mean is that it's not just for the elite or those that are like us, but for everyone. And with that, I want to just point out that the sad fact of the matter is that the folks working in tech or in design, whether that's in Silicon Valley or in the Nordics, the folks working in these privileged spots do not resemble the demographics that we're often designing for. So how did we get here, right? How did we get to this spot where there seems to be a lot of chaotic stuff happening in the tech world and the design world recently? And I want to show you this photo, which is from the 1940s. All that to say that we've been here for a while. So if you don't know what this photo is, this is the ENIAC machine, and it was arguably one of the first computers made in the world. And it was made in the US in the 1940s. And this was back when programming was women's work, and it was not paid well, and it was not seen as prestigious at all. And the ENIAC was made because they needed a tool to calculate weapons firing tables. So it was made for a war. It was made for the US Army. And I show this photo because, like many other historic technological advancements, whether in computing or in data science or in cognitive psychology, a lot of these advancements were made for the purposes of imperialism or colonialism, and we cannot ignore that history, because when we react to news like Clearview AI is creating facial recognition technology for the police, and we act shocked by that, we have to remember there is a precedent. So it helps, for me at least, to think about the drivers behind why we do things and what we're doing in this whole system, starting from us, but then also going out to the larger product team, and the larger design organization, and beyond that, the company, and also the locales in which we operate, like Silicon Valley or the Nordics, or the overarching tech industry, and beyond that, the racial capitalist system in which we all exist, which is a term that I'm borrowing from South African activists that was made popular by the late Cedric Robinson, who talks about how our systems of extraction and exploitation are linked directly with our societal constructions of race. And the driver behind a lot of these things is found in this hodgepodge of design and tech articles. And it's that word growth. Now, growth is super popular in our industry. We have growth designers, we have growth VPs, literal job titles named after it. We also have growth divisions and stuff in companies. And growth by itself in a vacuum is not necessarily ontologically bad or good, but we don't live in a vacuum, and we don't operate in a vacuum. And so our growth has an effect. And what I'm asking us is growth at what cost, right? The fact that in order to survive in the tech industry, companies have to ruthlessly design for growth is a bit concerning. And that's how it works, right? You see it in the way that companies lobby against any regulation that hampers their growth. You see it in the way that venture capitalists give funding to the startups that can promise short-term growth. And you see it in the way that we as designers or product teams work. And here's a typical product cycle, a very reductive version of it, and you've probably been familiar with it in some capacity at your jobs, where typically in a quarter you choose your quarterly objectives and key results, aka some goals that are kind of measurable, that might deal with things like engagement or retention. And then throughout the quarter, you work to tweak the product with your team to boost those OKRs. Again, bird's eye view of this product cycle. And I'm going to be stating the obvious here, which is that as employees, as designers, engineers, et cetera, our job performance hinges on our ability to create products that accomplish those OKRs, right? When you're doing your design reviews or your performance reviews with your managers, they're going to be asking you about, did you make impact? And that impact means that you've done something to help those OKRs, as opposed to like volunteering at the soup kitchen. They don't really care about that part, but they care about the impact that you've had on those particular metrics. So we have an incentive, indirect and direct, to fulfill those, and that ties into some of the practices that we see that are normalized in our field, right? And I've got 3 Google search results displayed here, one for gamification, one for nudging, and A/B testing. And these practices are super normalized in our field. You learn them at school, you learn them at boot camps, you practice them on the jobs. And as you can see in these search results, they're all written about in a very positive, like how to do this way. And I'm just pointing this out because these all kind of involve some kind of sleight of hand or obfuscation for users. And they're not necessarily bad by any means. I'm not saying we should get rid of them. But they do involve some kind of tweaking and some kind of leverage of users' cognitive tendencies, right? And susceptibilities to get them to do certain things. And the point that I want to make is that it's not that far of a leap to go from these practices to more deceptive design practices, ones where we blatantly create experiences that try to get users to not cancel subscriptions or to spend more time of their day on the app, etc., right? Creating that hooked feeling. And this is something that I've talked about at the Federal Trade Commission and the European Parliament. And it's one of those things where every time I talk about this, I want to emphasize that these deceptive designs, the ones that are really problematic, are never accidental. They're usually always intentional. It's really hard to accidentally create something that's, that blatantly deceptive. And it's exactly that kind of flow that makes it imperative that we as designers interrogate our own work and the way that we work. So what can we do? Helps to realize what ethics is and what it isn't in our practice, and in general as well. So ethics is not always necessarily law, nor is it necessarily religion or social norms. And regarding the law part especially, there's been plenty of things in the past that have been legal and that are currently legal, like undermining women's bodily autonomy, that are not ethical and that should never be ethical. At least in the US, I'm talking from an American perspective. If you ask a typical ethicist or philosopher what ethics is, they'll typically tell you that it's the exploration of what is good, what's bad, etc. And it's a very, of course, nebulous answer, and there's a lot of different schools of thought dedicated to exploring these concepts and these topics. And one of them is virtue ethics, which harkens back to Confucius and Aristotle, talking about habitual practices that uplift and emphasize certain values, traits, characteristics, right? Living a good life in that sense. And if we take that kind of view and we apply it to tech, what might that look like? There's certain values that I think should be at the forefront of our minds when we're designing. Things like safety. Also, lots of dog pics in this presentation, because dogs are great. Safety, right? Not just physical safety, but emotional and mental safety, right? If I'm using a product, I want to be able to feel like I'm included and not excluded. And I also want to feel like I'm not being targeted by any means because of factors that I can't change about myself. Also, transparency is super important. If you find yourself working in any kind of product that involves AI and ML, it's important that you have that explainability baked into your product so it's not a black box by any means. But also for other products that don't involve that kind of deep learning methodology, you have to be able to ensure that your users know what's going on and what they're getting themselves into. And regarding transparency, the typical consent forms that we sign, not good enough, right? Last but not least, autonomy. And what I mean by this is that we like to feel like we're in control of the products that we use. And it can be really scary to feel the other way around, that we can't unsubscribe, that we can't get out of an experience, right? And when I talk about autonomy, I want to emphasize that I'm talking about it from not a hyper-individualistic kind of point of view, like me, myself, and I, but rather a relational standpoint, one that factors in how socially embedded we are. And this draws from a lot of the scholarship from feminist philosophers like Marina Oshana and Catriona Mackenzie. So I want to highlight this one quote by Bell Hooks, who says that being oppressed means the absence of choices. And this quote stands out to me because I think it encapsulates those values of autonomy, transparency, and safety, right? And they all play into our users being able to have choices. And when I say that, I'm not being facetious in saying like, oh yeah, we have to let our users choose the color of the Twitter icon every day. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about meaningful choices that matter to them, choices that affect their data, their time, and their money. So as designers, how can we work on this to intervene the ways that we currently operate, to better think and reflect about these other aspects? There's two schools of thought that I think that can really help us when it comes to redesigning the design process. The first one is Deontology, which is just a fancy $5 word that means an intent-based ethical framework, drawing on why you're doing things and doing things because it's the right thing to do. And then the second one is consequentialism, also known as utilitarianism. And this is a results-based ethical framework. You might have heard of doing the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. That's what it means. And I think these two phases of intent and result can really map well to how we work as designers, because we start off by hopefully asking ourselves, is this problem that we've chosen a worthy problem to solve? And then we go to, what consequences does our solution have, right? And I want to really quickly note that your intent never abdicates you of responsibility for the results that you accrue upon others. And so what would that look like if we put that intent results paradigm over the standard design process? Now, this design process is from the Stanford D School. It's literally the first thing that comes up on Google when you look up design process. There's a lot of flaws with the design process in the way that that ideology is kind of spun up, but it's what everyone uses, and it's what you see in all companies that have their own variations of it, and you hear it in a lot of different kinds of names, right? Like double diamond, etc. For this presentation, I've used the Stanford D School process, and I've put the first two steps of empathizing with your users and defining the problem under the intent section, and I've put ideation, prototyping, and testing under the results section. And as I was saying, there are problems with this process. I don't know if it necessarily solves everything. It definitely doesn't solve everything, of course. And I don't know if it necessarily encourages us to think about things in a really critical way beyond just quick and easy results. So I've added in some steps, so more work for all of us. And one of the steps that I added in was evaluating, which I put in under the intent section. And that basically just means, as I said before, to ask yourselves whether the problem statement that you've defined is ethically worthy of being addressed. Not every problem should be solved. If someone came up to you and asked you to design an app that lets them steal money from everybody, you would hopefully say no. And also, not every problem needs to be turned into an app. You're not going to invent an app for homelessness. It's not going to happen. Then, after you've ideated solutions, going on to forecasting, asking yourselves, can any ethical violations occur if we implement this idea? This draws on a lot of scholarship from future studies and speculative design, and looking at what could go wrong, right? And then you move on to prototyping and testing, and you ship your product. And before you completely forget about it, monitoring it, going back and checking, okay, are there any new ethical issues occurring? What can we do to stop them or prevent them? It's really common working in tech to finish one project and rush off to the next exciting thing. And especially if you're in a consulting model, that's just kind of how it works. But if there's any way to kind of check back, it's really important too. And hearkening back to virtue ethics, can we make a habit out of this? And also, can we ensure that we are staying socially embedded and factoring in the vast, complex web in which we exist? And so on the website for Design Ethically, you can find a bunch of tools that engage with forecasting and monitoring, et cetera. And when I've done this workshop in the past, people often ask, well, if you forecast something bad, does that mean you shouldn't build it? Not necessarily. Some products should not be built, of course, but some products, you can view the forecasted consequences as other design problems that you have to solve to get around, right? If we never made anything, then literally nothing would exist. So we have to work with engaging these other design problems and solving them as we're going along. So looking ahead, moving beyond, it can feel, as I said, that there's not much we can do, but I want to share this photo from November 2018. This was a photo taken in San Francisco, and it was at the Google walkouts that was happening. Now, the walkouts were not just in SF. They were happening worldwide in Google offices everywhere. And this was because a couple of very senior executives, managers, et cetera, at Google had been accused of sexual harassment. And they basically just got let go with like a slap on the wrist and very generous severance packages, some of which are more than I make in a year. And it was a horrible slap to the face of the victims that had undergone what they went through. So people were furious, and they took to the streets, and they walked out. And I'm showing you this photo because I want to point out that we have unprecedented power today. We have new ways of organizing, better ways of communicating news and getting awareness across. And we have new ways of establishing that solidarity with people, not just in tech, but also community organizers and folks in academia and folks in policy. And it's important that we do that. It's important that we get out of our bubble in that sense. So how can we scale and mature this design ethics movement? And I call it a movement because it truly is that. It's not just one chief ethics officer sitting in their ivory tower, nor is it just a handful of people on Twitter who are really frequently tweeting. It's really you and I and all of the folks making the products from the ground up, boots on the field. So as an industry, we can equip designers with more than just design skills. There's a lot of amazing scholarship from other academic fields like disability studies and gender studies, et cetera, that we can draw from and learn from. Also, we can overhaul our metrics that we use to gauge our performance. Rather than just looking at things that relate to the bottom line, can we measure literally anything else? Things that reflect well for humanity and for those around us? That's easier said than done, by the way. Also, we can create a new pipeline, hopefully for a more diverse and inclusive workforce. If our current pipelines don't really help us vary up the demographics of who's working in tech or design, then we need to break our current pipeline and make a new one. As a company, you can encourage a culture of transparency and openness. Having the ability to discuss these matters in a safe way is really important. And related to that, granting amnesty to workers that do speak up, right? In the States especially, we've seen a lot of cases where companies have retaliated against employees who have spoken up and have fired them. And often the first ones to go are those that are Black and trans, who are organizing because they want their companies to literally just be better. And I think that's such a shame, because when people speak up, they care about the company enough to speak up, and they think it can improve. Finally, stop ethics washing. I think that's a huge one. We see that a lot. We see that with movements like Black Lives Matter and Pride Month, where they talk the talk, but they don't really walk the walk. And that's something that we need to be better about. And finally, as individuals, we can work on learning and unlearning, right? There are so many things that we can learn about folks that are different from us, places that are different from us, right? And also, as we grow up, we have a lot of societal baggage that we've been conditioned to kind of internalize. So how can we unlearn that? Defining your own values is a really important part. What do you stand for? What matters to you? Where do you draw the line? Because once you've defined your values, that will make it a hell of a lot easier for you to be okay with saying no. And I hope, really from the bottom of my heart, that you are never put in the position where you do have to say no, but odds are that you will be in that position at some point in your career. And I wish you all the strength for that. So I want to share this one quote from one of my favorite activists, Grace Lee Boggs. She says that in order to transform the world, we have to transform ourselves first. And I think that really ties into the idea of learning and unlearning and growing as a designer, not just in your typical design skills bubble, but also beyond that. And finally, last dog image of the day. Sharing this to say that it's really hard. This is really, really hard work, and it's daunting and it can be scary, but it is so worth it. And finally, nobody is neutral, and doing nothing is not neutral. Doing nothing is being part of it. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for listening. I hope you have a wonderful evening.